Welcome to the Inca. Today I have a PowerPoint for you. You won't see me, you'll just hear the PowerPoint after I get it going. Let's see if I can make that happen. Yep, here we go, the Inca.
Today I want to introduce you to the Inca, an amazing civilization that came to power around the same time as did the Aztec. The Inca populated the area that is now called Peru. Here you see Machu Picchu. This is an absolutely spectacular settlement of the ancient Inca. It's located northwest of Cusco, Peru, which is the capital of the Inca and today. It's perched in a really high, narrow saddle between two sharp Andean mountain peaks overlooking the Urubamba River, which is 2,000 feet below. You don't want to fall. The Inca city was never discovered by the Spanish conquerors, but it was brought to the world's attention in about 1911 when an explorer named Hiram Bingham rediscovered and photographed it. This Inca settlement still remains a mystery. People don't really know if it predated the Inca, if it was made during the height of the Incan civilization, or if it was made after the Spanish came as a place to retreat and survive. Whatever the case, it is one of the best known ruins of the Inca civilization, and it's absolutely marvelous in its architectural detail, and I hope that you go and visit someday, as I intend to do. Here you see another view of Machu Picchu. Very beautiful. You can hike to it, or you can take a train almost up to it if you decide to travel there one day. So here you see some evidence of the stonework mastery at Machu Picchu. The stones are so carefully cut and put together that you cannot even insert a playing card between the stones. Notably, these structures have survived hundreds of earthquakes. This slide gives you a sense of the location of the Inca Empire as well as how it expanded and a view to their really extensive road system, which was so impressive because they go through huge peaks, 22,000 feet, down to desert areas along the coast. So a myriad of different sort of biomes that were really challenging. And wait till you find out how they got messages across their kingdom in just a very short amount of time. So this gives you a view of that rainless coastal desert terrain and of one of the peaks. Again, peaks went up as high as 22,000 feet, and so you might get, in 4 vertical miles, climates might vary from the tropical to the polar. Here you see Incan adenes, or terraced fields, and the Inca had to develop really effective agricultural techniques to manage their landscape. Huge mountainsides, they straightened rivers, they drained marshes, they channeled water into the desert to make them bloom, but what's most impressive to me are these terraced hillsides that they made to grow their food. They are typically about 5 to 13 feet high, and they might measure from 50 to 200 feet wide and as much as 5,000 feet long at the bottom of the incline. But since they tend to narrow as they rise, they may only be big enough on top for a few rows of corn or vegetables, like potatoes, were grown widely. The walls were built of field stones, and then they were backfilled with rubble to ensure really good drainage. They would dump the Inca laborers would dump thousands of loads of earth into each terrace. They would carry the dirt up from the valleys in baskets strapped to their backs. Sometimes they would be fertilized with bird guano, which you can see here in some islands off the coast of California. There's an entire island covered with guano. It's pretty cool to see. To irrigate the fields, they would construct channels to bring water from the glacial-fed rivers and to sort of manage the rainwater. It was pretty amazing. They were able to reap really rich harvests of corn and potatoes and quinoa, which you may be familiar with. Quinoa comes from this area of the planet.
More.
Here you see Lake Titicaca, and this is an amazing lake that where the Inca did live, and it's still many people, Peruvians, live today. It's actually the highest navigable body of water in the world and the largest lake in South America. It skirts the border between Peru and Bolivia to the east, Peru to the west, and Bolivia to the east. It's 3,800 meters above sea level. And on the bottom here, you see some reed boats, would have been traditional craft used by the Inca people. Saw a little bit about how the Inca Empire expanded in an earlier slide. At the top of the Inca society is the Sapa Inca, the supreme authority. They asserted that he ruled by divine right, and he was very revered everywhere he went, in this life and in the next, because they were immortal. And after they died, their bodies would be preserved as mummies, and then those mummies would be taken out and consulted and given all sorts of respect. So you were emperor for life, even though another emperor might come after you. You too would have your own palace and everything, even after death. He would be carried in a golden litter, as you see on the left there, encrusted with jewels, accompanied by thousands of followers. He might have hundreds of wives, but his special wife would come from the chosen women and would be someone that he was related to, like a sister, because they believed in, the royalty of blood. He forbade subjects to look him in the eye. Others coming to see him would have to go barefoot. Like I said, the Sapa Inca would have hundreds of wives, and these were a group of women that were chosen on basis of their beauty, skill, and social rank to serve him. And his empress, or Koya, would again be his sister. One famous Indian emperor was Pachacuti, and he was the ninth ruler and the first major Incan emperor. And he, clad in the skin of a puma, took on some people that were coming to invade, and he did repel the enemy. And he was said to have a vision that he could use warfare to spread Inca culture and religion. And so, what he would do, he took an interesting approach. He would send an emissary to the people that he was thinking of attacking, preaching the advantages of surrender. Like, if you surrender without fighting, we'll make sure you all have jobs and food, and you'll be well taken care of. And if you don't, well, we're going to attack you and kill you and overcome you. And so, oftentimes, people would just choose to join. By promising peace and gifts, and backed up, of course, by the threat of conquest, he was able to win over foe after foe, and then take over a vast amount of territory. He did allow people to speak their native language, although everyone was required to learn Quechua, which was the language of the Incan people. He would let people continue to practice their original religions, worshiping whatever gods they had, as long as they incorporated the Inca gods. Of course, if anyone was troublesome, he might take an entire community and uproot them to another area where they would cause less trouble. Another notable Incan emperor was Topa Inca Yupanqui, and this was the son of Pachacuti. And what he did is he expanded the empire to its ultimate boundaries, which again you saw in that earlier slide. And its empire at its height would extend to a length of about 2,500 miles, almost as long as the United States is wide. Okay, it's very narrow, empire along the coast of what is now Peru and Chile. But it was amazing and included at least 100 different ethnic groups, all of whom were united under the Inca rule and culture. Here's some more pictures of the Sapa Inca, one in a reenactment on the left, Incan Empire on the bottom right. You see Inca Emperor with some chosen women, again, reenactment. And then on the upper right, a illustration of what it might be like to be carried in the litter. Here you see the Incan social hierarchy, which basically has the Sapa Inca, the emperor at the top, then royalty, which would include the royal family, the nobility, and the commoners. One of the things that was really interesting about the Inca is how controlled it was. From the nobility, there would be about 500 or so leaders of the bureaucracy, the army, and the priesthood who would rule over the vast empire in the name of the Sapa emperor. And below these leaders was an administration that was broken down by decimal levels with leaders at every level. To administer the vast empire, the Inca broke down the populace into decimal units. Every 10 households was governed by the head of one of the households. Those leaders would report to the heads of groups of 50 households. Above them were leaders of 100, 500, 1,000, 500, 5,000, and 10,000 households. At the low end of the decimal organization were the Caracas, who were often successful leaders from groups in surrounding regions that the Inca had conquered. And it was really interesting that they managed to keep track of an empire of almost 12 million people by having these units that would start with 10 people reporting to one person, up to 10,000. One person being sort of in control of 10,000 people. Very interesting. Despite its size and complex organization, the Inca ruled the empire without the use of a written language as we know it. They developed a substitute for writing known as the quipu, and we really don't know everything about the quipu yet. People are still studying it extensively today. It's a very unique system among human inventions and very well suited to the needs of the Inca. It consisted of knotted strings of cotton or wool, dyed in many colors, and sometimes comprising of hundreds of strands of varying lengths. The quipu maker, called the quipu camayo, or keeper of the quipu, could record the number of llamas, quantities of corn, or numbers of days commoners worked for the government by tying different kinds of knots in different colored strings. Using a decimal counting system, the Inca placed the knots on the string to indicate their place value. For example, 1705 llamas would have been recorded with one knot in the thousandth position, 7 knots in the hundredth position, no knot in the tenth position, and a 5-knot loop in the ones position. And today, they also think the quipu may contain language that we use, just demonstrated through the use of different colors, different fibers, and different knot placements. Throughout the empire, strict Inca law regulated the lives of commoners. The state demanded that everyone work in designated jobs for every man, woman, and child to fill from the age of 5 on. People would be required to do different things at different ages. Some of them were kind of funny, the ages that they had. Imperial officials oversaw where people lived, what crops they grew, and how they dressed. In addition to working their lands, commoners were required to work in the Inca's fields and paid taxes that supported the empire's bureaucracy, priesthood, and other officials. Each household also had to work in state-run enterprises. They might be making the roads, like you saw at the right, storing grain, or they would give a portion of what they grew to the Inca government, and you see some storehouses in the center bottom picture there. They might be building a temple. The photo on the lower left is on the ruins of the temple of the sun god, and the top picture is illustration of the Inca going to war, and so you see some Inca warriors there. They also might be doing things like besides spending a year in the army, they might be doing some service in a ceramic shop. Of Of course, they also had to grow a huge number of crops. They grew beans, squash, peanuts, cocoa, cotton, quinoa, potatoes, and they would store them. They had a way of freeze drying their food, which allowed them to store and keep food for times of famine or want. It was pretty amazing what they were able to do. Of course, there's much, much more to the Inca civilization that was astounding. And I'm going to work my way down from the upper left. In the upper left, there you see a little girl. This is from contemporary times, holding a beautiful baby animals, llamas, and other animals. Straight down, there is a picture of a young girl who was from Incan times. She was actually a sacrifice. They did tend to sacrifice children in a really interesting way, which some of you may choose to explore in more depth later. Underneath the girl holding the baby llama is cocoa plants, one of the plants that was derived. Below that, you see a picture of a skull because the Inca did perform surgery and even brain surgery, and there's indications that many people had more than one bout of brain surgery. This is from people who didn't even use the wheel, you can imagine. Then you see some llamas in the lower right. Right across from there, you see some mummies of Incan royalty. Going up to a ruin showing some of their amazing architecture. In the upper right, you see pottery, and going down from that, some beautiful textiles made by contemporary Peruvians and also made by the ancient Inca. And finally, on the lower right, you see a runner, and this is how they would get information from one point of the country to a far point of the country. People would actually run messages. He's blowing into a conch shell then to alert the next runner to get ready to go, and he's carrying a quipu, which was how they would, store their messages to get from one place to another place. So lots of interesting things. One last thing I had to show you is, as well as amazing roads, the Inca would have to build bridges across the rivers with their incredibly high mountains. Here's an example of a bridge that they may have had to cross. And this doesn't show you how incredibly high it is, but it is quite a tall bridge. And you could go today and you could be brave and choose to walk across this swaying rope bridge, which might be rebuilt each year if it's found not to be up to the safety standards of the time. Here's a few more things that you might be wanting to look more into as we study the Inca.